Everyone should think that the mafia does not exist. This is the main law of the mafia, which has been reigning on the planet for 50 years. However, at the beginning of the last century, it was far from it. The mafia did not just exist, it actually ruled entire cities and sectors of people's lives. Moreover, the mafia very brazenly declared its existence, gave interviews in newspapers, and convinced people that it was impossible to defeat it. And where did this bravery came from? Why was it necessary, and why did the poor people adore the mafiosi? We will talk about this in the next couple of minutes with our guest Francesco Totti. Francesco was a typical descendant of an Italian migrant family who moved to the United States. He lives in Chicago in 1931, the heyday of Mr. Al Capone's famous empire. Our Totti comes from a poor family and has never relied on anyone's help. 10 years ago, working at the factory, he drank in a secret pub because officially in the U.S. reigned dry law, and there he was offered an interesting job. It was to race to Canada, where alcohol was allowed, buy it, and illegally distill in Chicago. In general, the task was quite simple because the proposal came not from someone, but from the guys from the mafia. The mafia had their people both at the border and at intermediate points. Of course, our Francesco was uncertain, and there was a chance of going to jail. But the salary of the so-called soldiers working for the mafia was quite sweet, and once in prison they knew that the mafia would not abandon them, providing good living conditions. Back then, no one shared with Totti any plans for a mafia empire. Independent chains existed separately, so that in case of their capture there was no evidence to identify serious mafiosi. After a few years, Francesco established himself and moved up in the career, beginning to cooperate with Papa Gionia. Also known as Johnny Torrio, our Totti was a soldier and mostly collected tribute from the stores where he used to deliver alcohol underground. He also had to rob, shoot, and even kill people. The mafia knew that the FBI and police officers have no right to kill under any circumstances, so the assassination mission definitely confirmed the frequency of the ward. And even at this stage, there were no ties to the mafia. All assignments were delivered through underlings, so as not to stain the leadership. Francesco wanted to serve, and as a result, in 1931, he finally became caporegime. For 10 years, the situation in Chicago has changed. Papa Johnny has formed a serious gang, and a few years have retired. His place was taken by Al Capone, who eliminated all competition and brought the Chicago gang to a new level. Capone officially introduced the concept of racketeering. Now the tribute was collected not only from local illegal establishments, it was collected from everything, including banks and stores. But it's worth noting that tribute wasn't such a bad thing back then. The Great Depression, the worst crisis in U.S. history, was unfolding outside the window, and tens of millions of unemployed and embittered people were walking the streets. Crime was across the country, and the police could rarely deal with it. And at the same time, giving the mafia money store guaranteed protection from any manifestations of gangsterism. Roughly speaking, the mafia acted as an analog of private security organizations, often even representing their employees wherever necessary. Our Francesco managed to work in such a position, but recently he became caporegime, which was one of the maximum positions for a mere mortal. In military slang, a caporegime is a kind of mafia captain. He acted as a bridge between the leadership and the common soldiers. Totti met Al Capone several times and knew the family's secrets at a high level. And it's his job to organize the execution of low-level plans. Mostly it's like a routine, and the process is practiced to the point of automaticity. The most popular task is still the same delivery of alcohol, only now Francesco leads a mountain of soldiers bribing border guards on the border of the U.S. and Canada. Then, Totti gives the task to find simple performers, and in turn sends other soldiers to collect from the whole business profit. All communication is done exclusively through a fake men, and Totti cannot be suspected of crimes at any level. Officially, he is listed as the head of one of the small laundries, and quite successful. If anyone did not know, Al Capone came up with an ingenious way to launder money from illegal alcohol, prostitution, and racketeering. Mafiosi set up a mountain of laundries across the U.S. They did work in offering the cheap service and best prices for the working class. And the genius was that it was impossible to count the exact number of actual laundry users, and Al Capone, together with his captains, could draw absolutely any figures, quietly legalizing the business. It was ironic, but ordinary people were even grateful as they got the opportunity to do laundry for pennies. Actually, the very concept of money laundering came from here and got its name, and laundries were not the only thing for which the poor loved Al Capone. First of all, most of the work of our Francesco did not interact with ordinary people. Rather, the mafia benefited from making the common laborer feel safe. He could visit their pubs and pay for illegal whiskey and women. And what to steal from a poor citizen? The mafia was not interested in pennies. The guys worked with bigger fish. Often, our Tati gave orders to soldiers to deal with bandits who robbed and killed ordinary Chicagoans. The police could investigate such cases for months, and the mafia solved the issues in a matter of hours and therefore enjoyed the sympathy of the people. But even this is not the case. Our Francesco on the profits from the work of laundries finances one of the canteens, which offers free food to the poor. There were many such in times of severe economic crisis in the United States. The decree to finance the canteen was filed personally by Al Capone, because in the first place helping the poor is a traditional calling card of Cosa Nostra and the Italian mafia in general, and in the second place the media conducted a fierce campaign against Al Capone, and he needed to raise his image at any cost. In a book called Mr. Capone by Robert Schoenberg, there are dozens of cases of charity work done at the behest of the mafia boss. For example, once our Francesco provided a truck that collected the belongings of a lonely, evicted woman, rented her a new one, and moved everything. Also, Tati, on direct orders from Al Capone, blackmailed businessmen and forced them to give coal, clothes, and other vital items to the homeless and poor people of Chicago. In the same book, we mention the words of dozens of eyewitnesses collected, and all of them state that Capone was considered something like Robin Hood. And it is even about police officers, who willingly took the money of the mafia and nothing but the violation of senseless laws the mafia did not ask. In fact, the mafia had its own laws and even its own court. A couple of years ago, in 1929, representatives of the largest groups in the United States gathered in Atlantic City and established common rules of the game. Internecine wars are over, and now all strategic decisions are raised on a kind of mafia council. Our Francesco periodically received orders from there, and the vast majority of them consisted in the elimination of especially violent robbers and mafiosi. Only a couple of % of the gangsters' activities intersected with the general population. Most often, the mafia lived in a separate world. Al Capone was one of the founders of the so-called Dome, and all of Chicago followed his orders. Our Francesco had nothing to fear because even the mayor of Chicago, William Thompson, worked for Al Capone and very openly supported him. The mafia was incredibly clever in exploiting the holes in the U.S. judicial system. It makes it impossible to prove guilt through circumstantial evidence and motive. As we mentioned, the mafia never worked personally, preferring to use underlings and frontmen. As a result, human chains were formed to decipher which were almost impossible to decipher. It was a paradoxical situation. Every resident of the United States knew that our Francesco Totti, Al Capone, and dozens of other guys were the mafia. But no one could put them in jail because there was no motive or crime proofs. However, the case became a matter of principle even for President Woodrow Wilson. He personally demanded that the Secretary of the Treasury put Capone away. And hard times began for the mafia in Chicago. Nobody could prove their crimes. Nevertheless, the guys started to be persecuted from other sides. Taxes, administrative offenses, parking and carrying weapons, everything was going on. The same criminal court called the Dome came up with solutions. Al Capone went to jail for a year of his own volition to appease the raging officials. The mafia took advantage of another juridical feature in the United States, the difference in laws between the states. In Chicago, Al Capone had a legal right to bear arms. In Philadelphia, however, there was a prison sentence. So the mob boss traveled south and specially purchased police officers to put him in a prison with a deluxe cell. And that's where Al Capone sat for a year. And in the meantime, our Francesco and other gangsters were desperately trying to put things in order by eliminating the slightest accident. And in general, they succeeded. But Al Capone could not save anything because it was about personal enmity with the president. The head of the mafia got a crazy 11 years in prison for simple tax evasion. The media made it look like the mafia had been defeated. There were ostentatious arrests of gang members, but in reality, our Francesco easily got away with it. As we have already mentioned, arrested were only pawns, who quietly went to jail knowing that they would be paid for everything. And the top brass stayed free and moved down a level. Al Capone was a victim, but his case quietly survived, and as you know, thanks to movies and many documentaries, it still lives today. That doesn't change the fact that our Francesco was a bad man and did illegal things. But if you look at it from another angle, you can think of thousands of cases when official authorities sent people to their deaths by the millions. Needless wars, bloated crises, and dozens of other misfortunes were invented very officially and legally. So it is quite possible to understand why ordinary people warmly treated the mafia. See you again, friends.